The director who secretly installed a camera in my office once said my job existed because people like me imagined problems that weren't there. By the following Friday, that same man was sitting in a conference room staring at a video that destroyed his career. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you how that camera ended up ruining his career, I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? What's the temperature where you are today? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if stories about quiet justice resonate with you, consider subscribing. Every subscriber helps these stories reach someone else who might need them. My name is Dana Whitman. I'm the Senior Contract and Compliance Manager at a company that runs hundreds of corporate agreements and internal audits every year. I've worked here long enough to understand something most executives eventually forget. Rules only look unnecessary, right until they save you. 6 months ago, our company hired a new director of operations, Victor Halbrook. Victor walked into his first all-hands meeting like he had just discovered a conspiracy nobody else could see. After 10 minutes of corporate buzzwords about efficiency and accountability, he said something that made the entire room exchange uncomfortable looks. Trust is inefficient. Surveillance is better. Some people laughed. I didn't. Because when a leader starts talking about surveillance, it usually means he believes everyone around him is hiding something. Victor didn't trust departments, he didn't trust teams, and he especially didn't trust compliance. In fact, during one meeting, he casually introduced my department with a nickname, the Paranoia Department. Apparently, the person making sure the company follows the law is the paranoid one. So when I leaned back in my chair late one afternoon and noticed a tiny blinking light behind my bookshelf, I didn't feel surprised. I felt curious. I walked over slowly and moved 2 binders aside. There it was, a camera, small, quiet, perfectly aimed at my desk. No IT notice, no legal approval, no security memo, which meant only one thing: someone wanted to watch me without asking. And in this building, there was exactly one person arrogant enough to do that: Victor Halbrook. I stared at the lens for a long moment. Then I smiled, and I left it exactly where it was. Because if Victor Halbrook wanted to watch me work, I was more than happy to let him watch. Wait a moment. I have a small note. Parts of this story are dramatized and shaped with the help of AI to make the ideas clearer and the emotions stronger. I hope it resonates with you. And if it doesn't, feel free to step away, rest, and take care of yourself. Your well-being matters more than any story. The week after I discovered the camera, I did exactly what Victor Halbrook expected me to do. I worked. Emails, contract reviews, audit notes, compliance checklists. My routine didn't change at all. The tiny camera behind my bookshelf kept blinking quietly, recording every ordinary moment of my day. I made sure it had plenty of those to watch. Victor still treated me like the company's favorite suspect. During Monday's department meeting, he leaned back in his chair and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Compliance always acts like the company is about to be investigated." Then he looked directly at me and added, "Maybe that says more about the people running compliance." A few people chuckled. Most didn't. Public humiliation in corporate offices usually comes disguised as sarcasm. Victor had clearly mastered the technique. I said nothing. That's the trick with people like Victor. The more you argue, the more convinced they become that you're hiding something. So I worked, quietly, carefully, letting the camera behind my bookshelf capture every minute. Tuesday passed. Wednesday passed. By Thursday afternoon, the office had settled into its usual rhythm, phones ringing, printers humming. The low murmur of meetings happening behind glass conference rooms. At around 3:30, there was a knock on my door. I looked up. A man stood in the doorway, wearing a gray suit and holding a leather folder. "Dana Whitman," he asked. "That's me." He stepped inside and gently closed the door behind him. Then he placed a thick set of documents on my desk. For the next 20 minutes, we spoke quietly. Pages were reviewed, notes were written, a few signatures were discussed, nothing dramatic. Just 2 professionals discussing paperwork. But the camera behind my bookshelf recorded every second of it. And several floors above me, in his office, Victor Halbrook was watching the live feed. From his perspective, it looked very different. A closed door, whispered conversation, documents sliding across the desk. Exactly the kind of thing a suspicious man believes proves he was right all along. By the time Thursday evening arrived, Victor Halbrook had already convinced himself he'd caught something important. I didn't see his reaction in that moment. Of course, what I saw was the quiet end of a normal workday. The man in the gray suit left my office after about 20 minutes, carrying his folder and thanking me politely. I returned to my contracts, finished 2 compliance notes, and shut down my computer just before 6. From the outside, nothing about that afternoon looked unusual, but several floors above me, Victor was watching the camera feed again. He replayed the footage from the moment the knock happened. From his perspective, the scene unfolded like evidence. The door closed. My voice dropped to a lower tone. Documents appeared on my desk. Pages slid back and forth between us. And at one point, I picked up a pen and signed a page. To a suspicious mind, it looked perfect. Victor paused the video and leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen as if he had just uncovered the answer to a question he'd been asking since the day he arrived. In his version of the story, everything finally made sense. The paranoia department wasn't protecting the company. We were hiding something, and now he had proof. He replayed the 20-minute conversation again, this time slower. The camera angle wasn't great, but it didn't need to be. The closed door alone was suspicious enough for someone who believed secrets existed everywhere. Victor zoomed in where he could. He watched the moment the folder opened. He watched the moment I pointed at one of the pages. He watched the moment I signed the document. And somewhere in that sequence, the story inside his head finished writing itself. Dana Whitman had violated internal procedure, at least. That was the conclusion Victor chose. He reached for his phone and called the IT department. Pull the security footage from the compliance office camera. He said, all of it. I want the full recording from this afternoon saved. The technician hesitated. Which camera, the man asked? Victor's tone sharpened. The one in Whitman's office. The bookshelf angle. A pause followed on the line. Okay, we'll archive it. The technician finally replied. Victor ended the call and returned his attention to the screen. The video was still paused on the moment my pen touched the paper. He smiled. Not a big smile, just the tight, satisfied kind people wear when they believe they've been proven right. For 6 months he'd been looking for a reason to remove me. Compliance departments slow things down. That's how executives like Victor see it. We ask inconvenient questions. We force contracts to be rewritten. We stop shortcuts that look profitable but end in lawsuits. Victor believed I was the obstacle standing between him and whatever changes he planned to make. Now he thought he had something better than suspicion. He had evidence in his mind. The sequence was simple: closed-door meeting, unregistered documents, a signature on paper that hadn't passed through his office. Victor imagined how the conversation would go the next morning. He would call me into the conference room. He would press play on the screen. And then he would ask the question he'd already rehearsed in his head. Care to explain this from his perspective? The trap was already closed. What Victor didn't realize, what he couldn't realize yet, was that the real problem wasn't the video he had captured. It was the camera itself. Because that small device behind my bookshelf had never been approved by the company's legal department, the IT security team, or the internal privacy policy Victor himself had signed when he joined the company. In other words, the evidence he believed would destroy my career had a much bigger problem attached to it. The moment that footage entered an official review, someone would ask a very simple question: who installed the camera, and when that question was answered, the story Victor thought he was watching on that screen would begin to look very different. By Friday morning, he would finally understand that the recording he was saving so carefully wasn't the proof he believed it was. It was the beginning of a much larger problem, one that had his name written all over it. Friday morning arrived with the quiet tension that always settles over an office just before something important happens. By the time I stepped out of the elevator, I already had 3 emails waiting. 2 contract revisions flagged for review, and a meeting request marked urgent. The sender was Victor Hallbrook. Subject line Conference Room B. Now. I wasn't surprised. People like Victor don't sit on suspicions for long. When they believe they've found proof, they want a stage. Conference Room B was empty when I walked in, except for Victor and a laptop connected to the wall screen. The blinds were half closed, the lights slightly dimmed, and the air carried that strange quiet that usually means someone is about to accuse someone else of something. Victor didn't greet me. He simply gestured toward the chair across from him. Sit down. Dana. I sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Victor tapped a key on his laptop, and the screen lit up behind him. The video began playing. My office appeared on the screen, filmed from the familiar angle behind the bookshelf. The footage showed the exact moment the man in the gray suit stepped into my office the afternoon before. Victor leaned back slightly, watching my reaction rather than the video. On the screen. The door closed. The two of us sat across from each other. Documents appeared on the desk. Pages were turned. My pen moved across the paper. Victor paused the video. Then he folded his hands together on the table. Why was that man in your office yesterday? The question hung in the air. I looked at him for a few seconds before answering. Not long enough to seem nervous, just long enough to make it clear I was thinking carefully. Victor watched me closely. Silence can be uncomfortable in meetings like this. People tend to fill it quickly. Victor clearly expected me to do exactly that. When I didn't. He continued. You closed the door, he said. You passed documents back and forth. His voice carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed the situation was already solved. You were hiding something. I finally spoke. No, I said calmly. Victor tilted his head slightly. No, he repeated. No. I said again. I was explaining them. The room went quiet again. Victor frowned, clearly not impressed with the answer. Explaining them to who he asked. I leaned back slightly in the chair, matching the relaxed posture he'd used earlier. To the external audit investigator reviewing your department. The words landed heavier than I expected. Victor didn't respond immediately, for the first time since I walked into the room. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but just enough for me to notice. Confusion first, then calculation. He turned slowly to look back at the paused image on the screen. The gray-suited man sat across from me, his folder open, the company badge clipped to his jacket. Victor stared at it longer this time. The silence in the room grew thicker. Finally, he turned back toward me. An audit investigator, he repeated. Yes, reviewing my department. That's right. The confidence in his posture didn't disappear all at once, but something subtle changed in the air between us. The certainty he had walked into the meeting with was no longer quite as solid. Victor looked again at the footage, then back at me. You should have informed leadership about that meeting, he said. I shrugged slightly. The meeting was requested by the audit team. Another pause followed. Victor's fingers tapped once against the table, as if he were recalculating the situation in his head. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was the small detail that made the entire conversation almost surreal. I had known about the camera from the moment it appeared behind my bookshelf. From the first day, it blinked quietly in the corner of my office. I knew exactly where it was, and more importantly, I knew exactly who would be watching it. If you think staying calm and letting the truth unfold was the right way to handle Victor's accusation, leave a 1 in the comments. Your voice matters more than you might think. The silence in Conference Room B didn't disappear after my last sentence. It stretched across the table like a thin wire, tight enough that one wrong word could snap it. Victor Hallbrook was still staring at the paused video behind him, but I could see something shifting in his expression. It was subtle. The confidence was still there, but now it had to share space with something else. Uncertainty. Victor cleared his throat and straightened in his chair, as if adjusting his authority back into place. If there's an audit review happening, he said slowly, leadership should have been informed. The audit team contacted the compliance department directly, I replied. My voice stayed even, the same calm tone I used when explaining contract clauses to impatient executives. That's standard procedure. Victor studied me for a moment, clearly searching for the part of the story where I would become defensive. When it didn't happen, his attention shifted to the video again. The camera angle showed my office exactly as it always looked: desk, shelves, the edge of the window behind me, and the tiny blinking lens hidden behind the books. I leaned slightly forward. There's actually another issue here we should probably address. Victor's eyes narrowed. What issue? The camera? I said. He didn't answer immediately. I continued, keeping my tone measured. Company Privacy Policy, Section 4.3. Victor frowned as if trying to remember whether he'd heard that number before. The policy prohibits surveillance devices inside private employee offices. I explained. It also prohibits collecting internal employee data without consent. Victor shifted in his chair. And any security camera installed inside the building has to be approved by the legal department before it's activated. I added. The room went quiet again. Victor let out a short laugh. The kind people use when they're trying to make something sound smaller than it is. Dana, he said, leaning back again. I'm the director. I nodded once. Yes, I said. You are. Then I added the part he clearly hadn't expected to hear. You're also the one who signed the policy update last quarter. The words landed harder than I intended. Victor's smile faded almost immediately. Not completely, just enough for the shift to become visible. His eyes moved back to the screen, as if the answer might somehow be hidden in the frozen image of my office. I didn't say anything else. Sometimes silence does more work than explanations. Victor's fingers tapped lightly against the table while he stared at the paused footage. The tiny camera behind my bookshelf was still visible if you knew where to look. The same camera that had captured everything: the meeting, the conversation, the documents. Victor inhaled slowly, then turned his attention back to me. Security measures aren't unusual, he said. Companies monitor sensitive departments all the time. That's true, I said. When the cameras are approved. Another pause followed. I could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes, for the first time since I walked into the room. Victor looked like someone trying to solve a problem he hadn't anticipated. But arrogance is a powerful filter. After a moment, he closed his laptop with a soft click and stood up. I'll handle the audit situation, he said. You can return to your office. The tone was meant to sound final, like the conversation had ended on his terms. I nodded once and stood as well. Of course, I said. I walked out of the conference room without rushing. The hallway outside looked exactly the same as it had every other morning, employees moving between offices. Someone laughing near the break room. The low hum of printers somewhere down the corridor. Normal, calm. But behind that calm surface, something had already started moving. Victor still believed he could manage the situation. He believed the camera footage gave him leverage, and that whatever questions might appear could be handled quietly inside his office. What he didn't know yet was that the audit investigator had already asked for a copy of the recording. Not just a description of the meeting, the footage itself, which meant the very evidence Victor believed would protect him, was about to be reviewed by people who cared about one thing above all else: policy violations. And the first question they would ask wasn't about the conversation in my office. It would be much simpler. Who installed the camera? By Monday morning, the situation had quietly moved beyond Victor Halbrook's control. What he thought was a simple internal conversation on Friday had turned into a formal review over the weekend. The external audit team had already requested access to several internal systems. And the company's compliance channel, ironically, the one Victor often mocked, became the center of the process. When the auditors contacted me, the request was straightforward. They wanted documentation connected to the surveillance device that appeared in the footage from my office, because my role involved contract governance and policy enforcement. I was responsible for providing any records connected to internal security systems. I started with the technical basics. First came the installation logs, Our company's IT infrastructure automatically records every authorized device connected to the network. Cameras, printers, servers, everything leaves a digital trace. I exported the system log history for the previous 3 months and delivered it to the audit team. Next came access records. The security platform keeps track of which user accounts log into surveillance tools. Even the smallest internal monitoring system requires authentication credentials. The auditors asked for a list of accounts connected to the device stream. Then we reviewed the network history. Any device transmitting video has to communicate with the internal network. That communication leaves timestamps, connection paths, and IP addresses. It's routine technical information. But together, those records form a timeline that is almost impossible to dispute. When the auditors finished reviewing the documents, the pattern became very clear. The camera behind my bookshelf had never passed through the company's IT authorization system. It wasn't installed by the security department. It wasn't registered through internal equipment tracking, and no legal approval had ever been requested. In other words, the device existed completely outside the company's official infrastructure. That alone was a serious problem. But the records also revealed something else. The network logs showed exactly where the camera feed had been accessed from. Victor Hallbrook's credentials. The audit team didn't accuse anyone immediately. Professional investigators rarely do. Instead, they assembled the evidence step by step, documenting each element carefully before drawing conclusions. Still, the implications were impossible to ignore. Installing unauthorized surveillance equipment inside an employee's private office raises multiple legal concerns. Our internal policies mirror state and federal workplace privacy regulations, and those rules exist for a reason. Unauthorized monitoring can violate employee privacy rights. It can violate internal governance policies, and depending on how the information is used, it can open the company to labor-related litigation. By Tuesday afternoon, the legal department was officially involved. Their role wasn't to assign blame, yet it was to assess exposure. During a short meeting that afternoon, one of the corporate attorneys summarized the situation in terms that were difficult to misunderstand. Potential exposure, she said, glancing down at her notes, could reach $12 million in privacy-related liability if employee monitoring occurred without consent. The number hung in the room longer than anyone expected. $12 million. Even large corporations pay attention when legal risk reaches that level. Victor, who had joined the meeting late, suddenly seemed much quieter than usual. He asked a few questions about security oversight procedures, but the confidence that usually colored his voice was noticeably thinner. What the attorneys and auditors were discussing wasn't theoretical anymore. It was evidence. Every document pointed to the same conclusion: someone had installed surveillance equipment without authorization, accessed the video feed personally, and failed to disclose the monitoring to employees. And the digital records connected that activity to Victor's account. But the audit team wasn't finished. While reviewing the network data, one of the investigators noticed something unusual. The camera in my office wasn't the only unregistered device communicating with the internal network. There were additional signals. 3 of them. The connection paths led to different departments in the building: accounting, legal administration, and a small project office on the 3rd floor, which meant the camera behind my bookshelf wasn't an isolated mistake. It was part of a pattern. 3 more unauthorized cameras were discovered during the system scan, each quietly recording inside another employee's workspace. And suddenly, the investigation wasn't about one questionable device anymore. It was about a surveillance system someone had built in secret. By Wednesday morning, the investigation had grown far beyond a single suspicious camera. What began as a quiet review of one device behind my bookshelf was now turning into something much harder to explain away. The audit team had expanded their scope, and the pattern they were uncovering was becoming impossible to ignore. The technical analysis continued through the company's network logs. Every device communicating with our internal system left traces: timestamps, connection points, authentication attempts. Those digital breadcrumbs allowed the auditors to reconstruct exactly how the cameras were operating. The results were unsettling. The first device, the one in my office, had already been confirmed. But as the audit team followed the network connections, 3 additional devices surfaced. One signal came from the accounting department, another came from a small legal administration office, and the third was the camera hidden behind my bookshelf. When the auditors physically checked those rooms, the pattern became even clearer. Each camera had been placed carefully inside the workspace, not at the entrances, not monitoring common areas, not positioned for general security. Every single one of them was pointed directly at an employee's desk. The implication was obvious. These devices weren't protecting company property, they were watching people. That distinction mattered more than most executives realize. Security cameras in hallways or entrances are common and legal when properly approved, but cameras installed secretly inside private workspaces cross into a completely different category of risk. By mid-morning, the auditors scheduled a meeting with leadership to review their preliminary findings. Victor Holbrook attended the meeting as well. I watched him carefully as the investigators explained the device locations and the network activity associated with each one. Victor leaned back in his chair and listened without interrupting at first, his expression carefully neutral. When the auditor finished summarizing the locations, Victor finally spoke. "These were part of a security testing program," he said calmly. "We were evaluating internal monitoring capabilities." It sounded reasonable on the surface. Corporate environments test new security tools all the time. The explanation might even have worked if the details had matched the story. But they didn't. One of the investigators pulled up still images taken from the camera feeds. The screenshots showed exactly what the devices were capturing: desks, computer monitors, stacks of paperwork, employees working. None of the cameras were aimed toward entrances or hallways. They were aimed at the people sitting at the desks. The room grew quiet as everyone absorbed the images. I waited a moment before speaking. "There's another detail the audit team should probably review," I said. All eyes shifted toward me. "The footage itself includes audio in several segments," I continued, "and in one of those recordings. Victor explains the purpose of the monitoring." Victor's posture stiffened slightly. One of the auditors turned to the technician beside him. "Do we have that clip?" he asked. The technician nodded and pulled up a short segment from the archived recording. The room filled with the faint hum of the video playback. Victor's voice came through the speakers clearly. "I need to know what these people are hiding." The words hung in the air after the clip ended. No one spoke for several seconds. It wasn't the kind of statement that fit comfortably inside the phrase security testing. Across the table, Victor's expression had changed again. The confidence he'd been holding onto was thinning with every new piece of information. But the investigation wasn't finished yet. Near the end of the meeting, one of the auditors asked if anyone else had concerns about unauthorized monitoring. For a moment, the room stayed quiet. Then someone spoke from the far side of the table. It was Lauren, a financial analyst from the accounting department. "I think there might have been a camera in my office, too," she said slowly. Her voice carried the hesitation of someone unsure whether they should be speaking up at all. "But I noticed a small device on the shelf behind my desk a few weeks ago. I assumed it was part of the building security system." The room shifted again, because Lauren's office was one of the locations the auditors had already identified. And suddenly, the pattern wasn't theoretical anymore. Another employee had just confirmed she'd been watched by Thursday afternoon. The investigation had become impossible for Victor Holbrook to ignore. The audit team had confirmed the locations of the cameras. The legal department had begun reviewing potential privacy exposure. And another employee had already admitted she might have been monitored without knowing it. For most executives, that kind of situation would trigger caution. Victor chose a different approach. He went on the offensive. The message appeared in my inbox just after lunch. A meeting request marked urgent, sent directly from Victor's account. Subject: internal conduct review. When I entered the conference room, Victor was already there, pacing slowly near the window. The moment the door closed behind me, he turned sharply. "This has gone far enough," he said. His tone carried none of the careful calm I'd heard in earlier meetings. The frustration in his voice was obvious. "You've been cooperating with the auditors behind leadership's back," he continued. I took a seat without interrupting. Victor stayed standing. "You've been feeding them internal information," he said, pointing a finger toward the table as if the accusation itself were evidence. "Contract records, system logs, internal policies." He paused, clearly expecting me to deny it. "I didn't. Those documents were requested by the audit team," I said calmly, "and they fall under compliance responsibilities." Victor scoffed. "Compliance responsibilities?" He repeated. "Or sabotage." The word hung in the air. According to Victor's version of events, the investigation wasn't about unauthorized surveillance anymore. It was about me. "You've been trying to undermine leadership since the day I got here," he said, "working with outside investigators, leaking internal processes, creating the appearance of a problem that doesn't exist." I folded my hands on the table. The strange thing about accusations like that is how predictable they are. When people feel cornered, they look for a way to redirect attention. Victor wasn't defending the cameras. He was attacking the person who found them. "You've damaged the credibility of this department," he continued. "You've created unnecessary legal panic and exposed internal operations to outsiders." The irony of that statement almost made me laugh. Instead, I asked one simple question. "Would you like the board to watch the footage again?" The effect was immediate. Victor stopped talking. The room went completely silent. For a moment, he looked at me as if I had just introduced a new variable into a calculation he thought he had already solved. I didn't repeat the question. I didn't need to, because the footage contained more than just a meeting in my office. It contained the camera, it contained the angle, and most importantly, it contained the evidence that the surveillance device had been operating without authorization. Victor slowly pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. His earlier aggression had faded, replaced by the kind of quiet thinking that happens when someone realizes their argument has limits. "You're making a bigger issue out of this than necessary," he said finally. "Possibly," I replied, but we both knew that decision was no longer his to make. The legal department had already reviewed the initial evidence. The auditors had documented the device locations, and now another employee had confirmed she might have been monitored as well. Victor leaned back in the chair and rubbed his temple. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish here, Dana?" he asked. It was the first honest question he'd asked all afternoon. "I'm following the same policies we've always followed," I said. "The ones you signed?" Another silence followed. Then Victor stood up again and walked toward the door. For a moment, it looked as if the conversation had simply ended. But before he left, he turned back toward me. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," I replied. And he was right. It wasn't over, because later that evening, an email went out from the Executive Administration Office to several members of senior leadership. The subject line was brief: Emergency Board Meeting, Privacy and Compliance Review. Victor Halbrook wasn't the one escalating the situation anymore. The board was. The situation had reached the place every corporate conflict eventually leads the boardroom. When executive administration schedules an emergency meeting with legal, audit, and senior leadership present, it usually means the conversation has moved beyond internal disagreement. It becomes something larger: accountability. I arrived a few minutes early. The boardroom was already half full. Members of the audit team sat near the far wall reviewing documents. Two attorneys from the legal department were speaking quietly near the projector screen. Several members of the board had joined remotely on the display at the front of the room. Victor Halbrook entered shortly after I did. He looked composed, but not relaxed. His posture had the tight stillness of someone who understood the stakes, but was still trying to maintain authority. The meeting began without much ceremony. One of the board members nodded toward me. "Dana," she said, "please walk us through the timeline." I stood and moved toward the screen. The presentation was simple. I had no interest in dramatic explanations, just facts. "For context," I began, "I've worked with the company for 12 years in contract and compliance management." A slide appeared showing the department overview. Our team oversees compliance across more than 240 active enterprise contracts. I continued. The total contract value currently under governance is approximately $380 million. The numbers weren't meant to impress anyone. They were meant to establish something more important: scope. Because of that scope, I said, our department follows strict internal governance policies regarding documentation, privacy protection, and employee monitoring. I moved to the next slide. The timeline appeared. Last week, I explained. An external audit investigator visited my office as part of a standard compliance review. During that meeting, internal footage was captured by an unauthorized camera installed behind my bookshelf. The screen displayed the still image of the device location. The room remained quiet. Subsequent technical analysis confirmed that the camera was not registered through IT systems. I continued. It had not been approved through legal review, and it was operating outside the company's documented security infrastructure. I paused briefly. Further investigation revealed 3 additional devices located in employee offices. The slide changed again, showing the locations, accounting, legal administration, compliance, across the table. Victor finally spoke. I'd like to clarify something, he said. All eyes turned toward him. These devices were part of a security testing program, Victor explained. His voice measured. The intention was to evaluate potential monitoring vulnerabilities in sensitive departments. The explanation sounded rehearsed. Victor leaned forward slightly. I was protecting the company, he added. One of the board members raised an eyebrow. From what? Exactly, she asked. Victor hesitated. The board member continued. From your own employees. The question landed harder than any accusation. No one spoke for several seconds. Victor shifted in his seat. It was a preventative measure, he said. The quiet that followed wasn't hostile. It was something worse, skeptical. At that point, one of the legal department attorneys leaned toward the microphone. If I may add context, she said. The board nodded. Our preliminary review indicates that unauthorized surveillance of employees inside private offices may violate internal privacy policies as well as certain labor regulations. She glanced down at the legal brief in front of her. In addition, she continued, there is a potential regulatory dimension. The room grew even quieter. If employee monitoring occurred without proper disclosure or authorization, she said carefully, the company could face questions under federal compliance standards. She paused, possibly including a review by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The words hung in the air. SEC review. In corporate terms. That phrase carries weight. An SEC compliance investigation doesn't just examine the original violation. It examines governance failures, leadership oversight, and whether company policies were ignored at an executive level. Victor stopped moving entirely. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked less like someone defending a strategy and more like someone realizing the consequences of it. Around the table, several board members exchanged quiet looks. The conversation had crossed a line. This was no longer about a disagreement between a director and a compliance manager. It was about whether the company itself had been placed at regulatory risk. And at that moment, everyone in the room understood that the final judgment was getting closer. By the time the legal briefing ended, the mood inside the boardroom had shifted completely. What had started as a tense presentation of evidence was now turning into something heavier consequences. I could feel the change in the room, the same way you feel pressure drop before a storm. No one raised their voice. No one argued loudly. But every word carried more weight than it had an hour earlier. One of the board members leaned forward and folded his hands on the table. Let's be clear about what we're looking at, he said. If the findings presented here are accurate, this situation carries multiple layers of risk. He began listing them one by one. First, there was the issue of privacy litigation. Unauthorized monitoring of employees in private offices could easily trigger civil complaints, even if no one filed immediately. The possibility alone created exposure the company could not ignore. Second, there were potential labor violations. Workplace monitoring laws vary by jurisdiction, but installing undisclosed cameras inside individual workspaces almost always crosses legal boundaries. Third, There was reputational damage inside the organization itself. Trust between leadership and employees is fragile. Once people believe they are being secretly watched, the damage spreads faster than any legal problem. Around the table, several board members nodded quietly. Victor, however, had stopped trying to appear calm. "This is completely out of proportion," he said abruptly. His voice cut through the room. "I implemented a security measure, and suddenly we're talking about lawsuits and federal investigations." One of the attorneys opened her mouth to respond, but Victor kept going. "And let's not pretend this investigation appeared out of nowhere," he added, gesturing toward me. "Dana Whitman has been feeding information to outside auditors from the beginning." I felt several pairs of eyes shift toward me. Victor's tone sharpened further. "She set this entire situation up." He continued. "She knew exactly what she was doing. Every document, every log file, she's been building a narrative." For a moment, the room went silent again. Then the audit investigator spoke calmly. "The footage we reviewed contradicts that claim," he said. Victor turned toward him. "What footage?" he demanded. "The recordings captured by the camera installed in Ms. Whitman's office." The investigator replied. He tapped a few keys on the laptop connected to the screen. The video appeared again. The same angle. The same blinking device behind the bookshelf. The same timeline of the meeting Victor believed would incriminate me. But the recording also showed something else. The device itself, the placement, and the technical markers confirming it had been transmitting through unauthorized access. The investigator paused the video. This footage was obtained from the device linked to Mr. Holbrook's user credentials. He explained. Victor leaned back in his chair, as if the room had suddenly become smaller. One of the board members spoke quietly. "I believe we've heard enough." Another nodded. A brief discussion followed low voices, measured phrases, the kind of corporate language that signals decisions are already forming. Then the chairman addressed the room. "In light of the evidence presented," he said, "the board will proceed with an immediate vote regarding Mr. Holbrook's leadership status pending further investigation." Victor opened his mouth to object, but the chairman continued. All those in favor of temporary suspension hands rose around the table. The vote took less than 10 seconds. Victor Holbrook was suspended from his position, effective immediately. No one applauded. Corporate justice rarely looks dramatic. It usually arrives in the form of short sentences and formal language. Victor stared at the table for several seconds after the vote. But the meeting wasn't finished. One of the HR directors spoke next, holding a printed report. "There is an additional detail the board should be aware of," she said. Everyone looked up. "Our internal review of the device access logs shows that the surveillance feed was not only accessed from the company network." She turned a page in the report. "It was also accessed repeatedly from a private laptop connected through Mr. Holbrook's home network." Another quiet ripple moved through the room, which meant Victor hadn't just installed the cameras. He had been watching them from home. By the time the board meeting ended, most people in the room left quietly, speaking in low voices as they stepped into the hallway. Corporate decisions rarely explode into dramatic arguments. Instead, they settle like dust after something heavy collapses. Victor Holbrook remained seated for a few moments after everyone else began gathering their documents. I stayed as well, closing my laptop slowly, while the legal team continued discussing next steps with HR near the door. Eventually, Victor stood. He didn't say anything to the board members as they passed him. No handshake, no farewell, just silence, when the last of them stepped out. The room grew still. It was just the two of us. Victor walked around the long conference table and stopped across from me. Up close. The confidence that had defined him for the past 6 months looked thinner. Not gone, but worn down around the edges. He studied me for a moment. Then he spoke. "You planned this." The accusation wasn't shouted. It was quieter than that, almost reflective, like someone replaying events in their head and trying to decide where things turned against them. I shook my head. "No." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You knew about the cameras?" he said. "Yes." "You knew the auditors were coming?" "Yes. And you let everything happen anyway. I leaned back slightly in the chair and turned my laptop toward him. You recorded it. Victor followed my gesture and looked at the screen. The paused video frame from my office appeared again. The image showed the same scene the board had reviewed earlier: my desk, the documents on the table, and the small lens hidden behind the bookshelf. Victor stared at it for several seconds. Something shifted in his expression again. The same slow realization that had begun earlier in the boardroom. The camera he had installed to watch me was now the most damaging piece of evidence against him. You could have removed it, he said finally. Yes. You could have reported it immediately. Yes. Victor looked back at me. Instead, you waited. I shrugged slightly. You were already recording everything. I said. I didn't need to interfere. The truth settled between us. Victor had spent months believing he was uncovering secrets inside the company. He installed cameras to catch employees doing something wrong. What he never considered was that the cameras themselves might become the problem. You set the trap, he said quietly. No, I replied. You built it. For the first time since we met. Victor didn't have an immediate response. He walked to the window at the end of the boardroom and looked down at the parking lot below. The silence lasted long enough that I wondered if the conversation was over. Then Victor spoke again, without turning around. What happens now? It wasn't a challenge this time, just a question. The investigation continues, I said. Victor nodded slowly. And the board. They'll decide the next steps. Victor finally turned back toward me. I was trying to protect the company, he said again, though the conviction behind the words had weakened. Maybe, I said. But we both knew that explanation wouldn't carry much weight anymore. At that moment, the door opened. One of the HR directors stepped inside, holding a folder. Mr. Halbrook, she said, her tone professional but firm. We need a moment of your time. Victor looked from her to me. Then he nodded. She handed him the folder. Inside were the documents beginning the formal termination process. The company wasn't just suspending him anymore. It was ending his contract. Victor closed the folder slowly. For a moment, he glanced back at the laptop screen, where the frozen image of the camera still stared from behind the bookshelf. The device he installed to monitor me had done exactly what he intended. It revealed the truth, just not the one he expected. Monday morning arrived quieter than usual. By the time I walked through the front lobby, most employees already knew something had happened over the weekend. Corporate news travels fast. Even when no one officially explains it, conversations stopped when people saw me pass. Not out of hostility, more like curiosity mixed with relief. Outside the glass entrance, Victor Halbrook was standing beside the security desk. A small cardboard box rested in his arms. Inside it were the usual things people carry when they leave a job: suddenly files. A framed photo, a company notebook. Nothing dramatic. Just the ordinary remains of an office that no longer belonged to him. His badge had already been deactivated. Security was escorting him out of the building. Victor didn't look at me as he walked past. No access, no title, no authority left. Just another employee leaving the building for the last time. I continued down the hallway toward my office. The door looked exactly the same as it always had, but the room felt different the moment I stepped inside. The bookshelf stood against the wall. The tiny camera behind it was gone. In its place, there was only an empty gap between the binders. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. A new message had arrived while I was walking in. Subject: promotion review. Director of Compliance. I leaned back and smiled slightly. Victor once said something during his first meeting here. Surveillance reveals the truth. He was right. It just revealed the truth about him. There's a strange moment that happens when someone in power realizes control doesn't always mean being right. In my case, it wasn't anger or revenge that changed the outcome. It was patience, documentation, and letting the truth unfold on its own timeline. Situations like this happen in many workplaces, though they rarely make headlines. Someone is blamed too quickly. Someone else stays quiet because speaking up feels risky. But the real question is this: if you were in that position, what would you do? Would you react immediately? Or would you stay calm long enough for the facts to speak for themselves? What surprised me most wasn't the investigation or the boardroom vote. It was how many people later told me they had experienced something similar, but never felt they had the support to stand their ground. Stories like this matter because they remind us that fairness isn't always loud, it's often quiet, careful, and persistent. I'm curious where you're listening from today. Drop your city or country in the comments so we can see how far this story has traveled. And if this story resonated with you, subscribing, liking, or sharing the video might seem like a small action, but it can help these stories reach someone who needs encouragement to stand up for themselves. In a way, every person who shares a story like this becomes part of that quiet justice too. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.